Welcome to the first lecture on functions. And as we kind of saw with the direction analogy I gave you, all a function is a block of code that you can save and reuse later, whenever you want. And as I mentioned previously, functions are the bread and butter of programming. You have to know how to deal with functions because you do not want to be duplicating code every time you want to perform a repetitive task. So what this means is that you write a function once and you can use it as many times in the future. And just as an FYI on the side, remember semicolons? We did this in the syntax section. Generally, semicolons are used to separate executable JavaScript statements. But since a function is not an executable statement, and by that I just mean it's not automatically run, you have to actually call it or invoke it. We'll see that shortly. And because of this, it's not common to end functions with a semicolon. Although sometimes you'll even catch me doing it by mistake and other developers. So it's not the end of the world, but just bear in mind you don't have to end a function with a semicolon. And as we just said, functions are not executed immediately. Yes, you do get ifs, immediately invoked function expressions, but we're not getting into that now. In general, functions are not executed immediately. So how does a function look? How do we write it down? Well, firstly, you need to tell JavaScript that you are creating a function. How do you do that? Well, the simple answer is that we just use the function keyword. Now, before I go further, there are a few ways you can create a function in JavaScript. We're going to look at them. But no matter which way you use or whichever method you use to create a function, these general concepts that I'm teaching you now will apply to each different method. So if you understand what I'm teaching you now, you can apply this to any method of creating a function and you'll pick it up that much quicker. So here we're just going to use a function declaration in order to declare a function. We've got the function keyword. Great. So now JavaScript knows that we're wanting to create a function. But you'll agree with me that we're probably going to want to create hundreds, if not thousands of functions in our application. For example, you might want to create one function that greets your user when he enters your page. You might want to create another function that determines whether he's a member or not. You might want to create another function to determine whether he's deactivating his account or not. And if he does, you want to give him another message or an alert. These are different functions. And because of that, you need to distinguish between one function from another. You need to know which function to call, which function you want to execute. And how do we do this? Well, that's right. We need to give our function a name, so we know which function to execute when you need it. And let's call our function test for argument's sake. Now, what's the next thing we need? Well, as you start developing, you'll want to be passing arguments to these functions. For example, what about if we wanted to give a welcome alert to our user? We don't want the alert to say, "Hi, random user." We would want the alert to say something like, "Hi, John. Hi, Wally." And what allows us to do that is we have to pass in arguments. We have to pass in variables. And in order to pass in variables, you need to have parentheses. And that's it, guys. You have a function keyword. We're calling our function test. That's custom. We can call that whatever we want. And then you have to have the parentheses. But now say we want to pass in the user's name. So let's just put that in a variable called name. And yes, it goes in between the parentheses. And what's the last thing we need to do? Well, if you just left it at this, then JavaScript wouldn't know what to do. Great, we've defined a function, we've called it test, but what's it going to do? Well, at the moment it does nothing. And this is where the curly braces come into it. And don't get confused with objects. This is not an object. When JavaScript sees that function keyword, it's going to know that those curly braces are just a place where we define our code. And in programming, the place between the curly braces is just called a block. It's called a block of code. And that's where the meat and the heart of our JavaScript code will live. Continuing on with our example, let's just alert hi name to the user. And here we're going to use template literals, which we've seen in the syntax section. And that's it. That is literally how you write a function. It's not that difficult, right? It's intuitive, it's easy, and best of all, it makes a lot of sense. But at this point in time, we've only defined a function. We haven't run it, we haven't called it. And in programming languages, to run a function is known as invoking or calling that function. Again, don't get intimidated by these words. That's all invoking means. But let's jump in and see how we actually invoke this function. So as I mentioned, invoking a function just means running it or executing it. Let's look at our function again, function test. where we just alert hi name. To remind you that test is just a custom name we gave to our function. We can call it whatever we want. And how do we run this function? Well, we take our name, in this case test. All we do is we follow it by parentheses. It is that simple. You're now telling the JavaScript engine to go and run this function. But hang on, we did define that this function needs a variable called name, an argument called name. So let's do that. Let's just put in name. And that's it. That is all you do to invoke a function. Great, we've covered the theory, but now, as always, let's see some examples.